All right, thank you everyone for joining us today at the fifth and final day of the Center for Employment Innovation Research Symposium. Today we have two panelists speaking on the topic of impacts of inequity. Preet Banga and Kerrigan Martel will be presenting today, and I'm very much looking forward to both of their presentations. Before we get started with Preet's presentation, I'd like to take a moment to thank everyone who helped put today's symposium together. This week's effort has been put together by the Center for Employment Innovation with help from the Coady Institute. I'd like to take a moment to thank Marianne, Brendan, Joel for planning and organizing and giving all the moderators and presenters this opportunity. Thank you to everyone else at the Center for Employment Innovation for all the hard work that they put in as well, and at the Coady Institute as well. And thank you guys, of course, for joining us today. Before we begin, I'd just like to start with a brief land acknowledgement. So this summer at the Center for Employment Innovation, we've been working on sort of taking the land acknowledgement and taking that a step further to sort of reflect on where you come from and what that land means, and what peoples that land is ancestral for. And so I'm joining you guys here today from Antigonish, Nova Scotia, which is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. And so this territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship and was first signed by the Mi'kmaq, Maliseet peoples and the British Crown in 1725. And this treaty did not deal with the surrender of lands and resources, but in fact recognized Mi'kmaq and Maliseet title and established the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between nations. And over the course of this summer, I've also been reflecting on my hometown of Stratford, Ontario, and the land acknowledgements for Stratford. And so Stratford, Ontario is the ancestral territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples, and is covered by two treaties: the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant of 1701 and the Huron Tract Treaty of 1827. And so as we're presenting today, I'd encourage you all to take a moment to think about the land that you're joining us from and reflect on what that means to you. The other thing before we get started is I'd like to point out that you should be able to turn on closed captioning, which has like a live captions in case anyone's having audio issues at any point during the presentation. And you should be able to do that at the bottom bar on your screens. And so before we begin with Preet's presentation, just a bit about Preet. So Preet Banga is an undergraduate student pursuing an honors degree in psychology. Her minor is Women and Gender Studies, and her work with the McKenna Center over the past year has helped her develop an understanding of the impact that COVID-19 has had on communities. She focused on the impact of the pandemic on gender-based violence as part of her internship this summer at the Coady Institute. Preet's presentation is on the status of women in Nepalese society and the impacts of COVID-19. So I'm going to pull up Preet's presentation now, and then Preet, feel free to begin once that's up. All right, Preet, the floor is yours.
Perfect. Thank you, Evan. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to present at the Center for Employment Summer Research Symposium. This session is titled Impacts of Inequality, and I have chosen to speak about my research on the impact of COVID-19 related shutdown on the status of women, with a focus on gender-based violence. This is a huge topic, so I'm specifically presenting a case study on Nepal, a Himalayan nation in South Asia, and a neighbor of India, a country that I belong to. To give some background on why I chose to research on Nepal, well, I've seen a lot of Nepali women in India working as laborers or domestic workers. They were often beaten by their husbands and had no control over their earnings. Last year, while researching for the Stories of Hope website that I developed as a part of the McKenna Center grant, I came across an article on the plight of women during COVID-19. It stuck in my mind, and when I began to frame a research question at Coady during my internship this summer, this was the first issue that came to my mind. As I researched more on the topic, it was heartrending to read how badly the pandemic had hit young girls and women in Nepal. Nepal is a very small country in South Asia and is also considered a least developed country and has therefore not received a lot of attention from media or international NGOs. COVID-19 highly impacted this country as most of the unskilled workers in the informal sector had no employment insurance or benefits and were left jobless once lockdown was imposed by the government. India also suffered a lot due to the pandemic, but since it's a big country, it did get a lot of international attention, thus helping in mobilizing resources and funds or donations from other nations and international organizations. Nepal, on the other hand, being a smaller country, was mainly dependent on China and to some extent the World Health Organization and now the United States. For most international travelers, Nepal is known for its Buddhist temples and heritage and mountainous treks. But it is also among the least developed countries, which still lags far behind when it comes to employment. In Nepal, gender-based violence manifests itself in many forms, ranging from domestic violence, dowry-related violence, and child marriage to human trafficking. To take a look on the history and the impact of the Maoist insurgency on women, a major political shift occurred in 1996 when Maoist insurgents, most of whom are now in mainstream politics in Nepal, started the People's War with an aim to end long-standing structural inequalities in the Nepali society. Between 1996 to 2006, the conflict caused great political, social, economic upheaval in Nepal. Maoist conflict affected Nepalese women in various ways, and many suffered from gender-based and sexual violence and increased vulnerability as their husbands or father died in the conflict. However, the conflict also allowed these women to take on social and political roles which were previously reserved just for men. In terms of power in the post-conflict setting, it was found that both ex-combatant women, which means women who fought side by side with men, and non-combatant women have strengthened their position in the private sphere, where they encounter more equality between men and women. The non-combatant women more often took up leadership roles in their communities. But in the society at large, it was found that the division of labor and power continues to be highly embedded, and the war has not led to changes in mindsets or social structures. According to the available pre-pandemic data, 48% of Nepali women have experienced some form of violence at some point in their lives, with 15% experiencing sexual violence. During the pandemic, within the first few months itself, a 24-hour toll-free helpline run by Nepal's National Women Commission, the NWC, reported twice as many phone calls compared to previous years. Now, before I start the main presentation, let me just outline 3 intended learning outcomes from this presentation. The United Nations has termed violence against women during the pandemic as a shadow pandemic and called for a global collective effort to stop it. I believe that this research and the presentation would help raise our understanding about the situation in a small country like Nepal and the resources, if any, available to women and girls to seek help. The research can also be shared with partners focused on Nepal in addressing violence against women in the COVID-19 pandemic. And thirdly, this research can also help in framing a long-term strategy in understanding the root cause of the issue and addressing it. A large number of cases of gender-based violence go unreported as the stigma associated with being a victim tends to stop women from seeking help or reporting about it. To give a brief introduction on Nepal, it has a population of 29 million, out of which 49.6% are male and 50.4% are female. Nepal is one of the least developed countries in the world, and the majority of the population is involved in low productivity agriculture. While the Constitution gives fundamental rights to all citizens, irrespective of their ethnicity, religion, or sex, there are no specific laws to back these rights. In fact, the family laws in Nepal that govern marriage, divorce, and inheritance reinforce patriarchy and also limit women's rights to financial resources, though there have been some amendments in recent years to correct these issues. As it is a dominantly patriarchal society, women have a subordinate status, subjected to either their father or their husband. Practices such as child marriage and preference of sons, as well as polygamy, are prevalent in the society. Citizenship rights are also limited, and the constitution only grants citizenship to the child of a Nepalese woman if she can prove that the father of the child is not a foreigner and the child was born in Nepal. For Nepalese men, however, these clauses do not apply. Class differences further deteriorate the position of women in the Nepalese society. One category of class, which is known as the upper class or the Kshetri class, has more power than any other class. And within this, most men occupy superior positions than women. In addition, rural women from certain castes and ethnic groups experience larger inequalities because their rights and issues have not been included in the mainstream development. Looking at the position of women in the general economy, there is a huge population of women, which is about nearly 40%, who are economically active and are mostly employed in agriculture as unpaid family workers, meaning that they plow and do farming on their family land. While they bear burden of work at home and at the farm for long hours, it is all unpaid work. All the money that comes from agriculture goes to the head of the family, be it the husband or the son of these women. The available data shows that children, especially girls, start working at a young age, and that child labor involves more girls than boys. In the past 2 decades, there has not been much change in the status of women. A December 2020 research paper in the Nepalese Journal of Development and Rural Studies said that gender-based violence is often unreported in domestic as well as public arena and is largely attributed to derogatory attitudes towards women, which was reinforced by low socioeconomic status. So what happened when the pandemic hit Nepal? In addition to high risk of virus infection and lack of healthcare facilities, as well as unequal distribution of vaccines, the pandemic also resulted in lockdowns imposed by the governments to check the spread of the virus, thus shutting down all small businesses and employment opportunities. A World Bank official on Nepal warned that those in the informal sectors, which comprises over 50% of businesses in Nepal, such as street vendors and flea markets, face the risk of extreme poverty. The pandemic has hit the daily wage laborers and domestic workers very hard, and they make up a large percentage of Nepal's labor force. The impact has been huge for women, who make up 2/3 of domestic workers in Nepal. A study conducted by the government of Nepal noted a high rise in the number of unemployed women, and a majority of them lost their jobs and income during the pandemic. The study also found that women's unpaid care workload increased during the COVID-19 lockdowns due to school closures and restrictions on mobility outside the home. Looking at the pandemic and gender-based violence, even before the pandemic, women and girls were exposed to violence, but COVID-19 has worsened the risk. According to the available pre-pandemic data, 48% of Nepali women did experience some form of violence at some point in their lives, with 15% experiencing sexual violence. And during the pandemic, this number suddenly doubled compared to previous years. The COVID-19 pandemic is equally threatening for young girls in the country. Due to lockdown-induced closure of schools, the risk of girls witnessing violence at home and facing exploitation and abuse increased manifold. NGOs in Nepal noted an increase in number of complaints of child sexual assaults in the first 6 weeks of lockdown. In most cases, the accused was a relative or a close person, indicating that home is not always a safe space for young girls and women. The research noted that in addition to abuse, existing practices like child marriages prevalent in the country may also increase during the pandemic. A women's rehabilitation center, which is a gender rights group, collected data from various NGOs and government agencies to show a steep rise in gender-based violence during the pandemic. Vorek reported that most of the victims of violence were in the 17 to 25 age group, followed by women and girls aged between 26 to 35. There were 25 girl children below the age of 16 among the survivors. According to women's rights groups, the current support mechanism is not adequate to deal with the abuse during lockdown. Looking at the condition of single women in the pandemic, the situation for many single women during the pandemic has been dangerous as the sole income earner and caretaker for their families. Women for Human Rights, a Nepali NGO dedicated to improving the rights for single women, conducts focus groups through Zoom, while single women across different provinces of Nepal understand the challenges during COVID-19 throughout the country. During these focus groups, women across rural parts of Nepal reported that people with COVID-19 symptoms are often choosing not to get tested because COVID testing is too expensive or is not easily accessible. Some women explain that feeding their children during the pandemic and paying for household expenses has been difficult, so paying approximately $10 for a COVID test is simply not feasible. Some women also discussed fears of social discrimination or stigma associated with testing COVID positive, which has further prevented people from getting tested. Women in Nepal who were widowed as a result of COVID-19 face social and financial precarious position. According to reports, many widows have shared experiences of being stigmatized or ostracized from parts of Nepali society. Widows in particular are sometimes considered inauspicious, unlucky, promiscuous, or even responsible for their husband's death. Moving on to the role of NGOs and rights groups for women, organizations which work to secure the political, social, cultural, and economic rights of single women in Nepal have helped to pass several laws protecting the rights of single women, including the right to retain a deceased husband's property after marriage and the right to inherit marital property regardless of age. Due to their efforts and work with the government, women in Nepal now have the right to obtain a passport without a male family member's consent, and the right to sell or transfer property without permission from adult children, and the right to receive a single woman's social security allowance from the government regardless of their age. There's a lot that still needs to be accomplished in Nepal. In February this year, media reports highlighted that the government was proposing a new rule that says women under 40 years of age must seek consent from their family and even the concerned ward office to travel abroad on a visit visa. The proposed rule was severely criticized by rights and women's groups in Nepal. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the Women for Human Rights and other women's rights organizations in Nepal have been hit hard by funding losses and shifting priorities. Most local funding sources were reallocated to support the COVID-19 emergency response. In such a scenario, they're not able to allocate many resources to helping women face stigma or violence. Due to mobility restrictions during the pandemic, the National Women's Commission is running a 24-hour phone helpline to offer remote psychosocial counseling services. Achieving gender equality and empowering all women and girls is one of the challenges of the Sustainable Development Goals. Progress is continuously being reported in relation to the increased education levels of women, their global labor force participation, as well as their increased participation in leadership positions. The data shows that the informal economy often provides very constrained and gendered choices, which are not just unlikely to result in formalization, but more likely to reproduce income inequalities. On the one hand, the informal economy is a space that provides opportunities for income generation, as the barriers to entry in terms of skills, experience, and capital are low. It also helps women connect with others and share their skills and abilities, facilitating communal empowerment. However, in reality, given women's predominant use of skills acquired from the domestic labor, for example, cleaning, sewing, and caring, it also traps women in sectors that are overcrowded and unproductive, leading to insufficient income to make a difference in their lives. Thus, it is important to understand what groups of women get empowered, if at all, in the informal economy as a result of engaging in economic activities, and whether formalization will contribute to empowerment of women entrepreneurs in the informal economy. Thank you for patiently listening to me as I explained about gender-based violence in Nepal. My minor at the University in Women and Gender Studies has reinforced my interest in these issues as they're very close to my heart. Nepal has been in a state of constant political turmoil in the past many years, which probably has taken the focus away from social and mental health issues. It urgently needs to build a reliable health protection and justice system to support gender-based violence survivors. I strongly believe that social and women groups, right groups, and international bodies such as the UN, World Bank, and the World Bank can play a key role in putting pressure on the government to accomplish this task. And I have mentioned a few sources that I really found helpful in my research on Nepal and put them in the reference section for people to see. And that's all. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Preet, for sharing your presentation. That was very insightful, and I think everyone learned a lot from that. If anyone has any questions for Preet, feel free to put that either into the chat or the question and answer function. So Preet, I have a couple of questions just to get us started. My first question for you is, what do you think is the single most important thing that can be done to help improve the situation in Nepal?
Thank you, Evan. That's a good question, but narrowing down to one thing would kind of be difficult because the economy, the politics, and the domestic sphere are all connected. But to begin with, I would personally say a change in the justice system for the survivors of gender-based violence to first be recognized. That would be the very first step to begin change after that, but certainly a change in policies. And also, it also has a federal structure of government, so there's different levels, and women are basically at the lower or like the local levels of governance, but not much in the central levels of government. And so engaging more women in policy making and decision making so that they can voice their own opinions would be a great start.
There, thank you, Preet. And we have a question from Laura. So Laura is asking, I believe you said that most acts of violence against women in Nepal during the pandemic have happened with women between the ages of 17 and 25. Do these numbers and ages compare to the violence against women in Nepal that was happening before the pandemic, or even with other contexts in Canada or India that you're familiar with? And Laura's asking, why do you think this is?
I would say that this particular age group of women did face a lot of violence and assaults even before the pandemic, and the ratio has risen, but there's still more compared to other age groups. And I did mention right after that that even women in the 26 to 35 age group are also in the high bracket. The reason during the pandemic could be that this particular age group of women have had to stay back because schools and universities were shut down, and so they were more at home compared to outside. And during lockdowns, families were they were spending much more time within the household, and so as I said, that a lot of the accused people were family members, and so that gave more opportunities for such events to happen. But that's just statistics. That those age groups do come to be like higher in the percentage, but yeah.
Great. Thank you, Preeta. And thank you, Laura, for your question. So Preeta, I have another question for you. Do you think that the rates of violence during the pandemic will continue after the pandemic? And why or why not?
Well, I hope there's a change and it does not continue. But considering that slowly lockdowns are starting to get over and women are back to places of work, not saying that places of work are even a safe space, but they're not so much into the households and everyone's getting back into the economy and working, I would hope that cases of violence reduce. There have not been studies yet, of course, so I cannot give a scientific view on that. But change is constantly happening, and even now, groups such as Women for Human Rights and other organizations are working to create more safer spaces and also helplines, because there are also not a lot of places for women to go and talk to. For example, compared to, for example, Canada, there are a lot of helplines available for women and survivors of gender-based violence to speak to, but there's, I think, only a few in Nepal, and they're also slowly coming up. So I feel like that would be changed, at least over the period of the pandemic, and also seeing the condition now, that's also great motivation to begin change. So I would hope, but there's no data yet, so I can't speak on that.
Awesome. Thank you, Priya. And so we have a question from Marion now. So Marion's asking, given this topic is about the COVID-19 pandemic, which is still unfolding, could you speak to the methods for your research? Was most of your information gathered from non-governmental organizations working in Nepal? Did you have access to the focus group data that you mentioned? And what are the next steps for your research?
Evan, do you mind pulling up the last page of the references on my presentation? Sure. So it was basically a case study. I personally am not directly working with the people who are in Nepal, but I looked at the data that has been published. And so these are I think 5 of like the ones that I thought were very relevant to my research, but there is many more which I can probably share with people if they send me a message. But my area of research was not just NGOs, but also there's been a lot of academic research on Nepal, and so I looked at obviously sources such as ResearchGate and NoOneNet and other sites for my research, and looking at the statistics and the data that they collected. And most of them did use qualitative studies because it is such a topic, gender-based violence and social inequalities, and they did a lot of qualitative studies. So that was the main source of my understanding. Going ahead, the next few steps would be to look at the situation post-pandemic and how things have changed in the economy. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you for your answer, Priya. And just as a final question, are there any organizations working in Nepal on this situation that could be supported by people here in Nova Scotia?
So interesting question, because when there was in India, when there was the peak of the pandemic, and there was a whole movement where people, even in CNFX, tried to gather funds and resources to send in sorts of like donations to the country. But the problem is that they usually reach the top tier organizations and it doesn't flow down to the local organizations that actually need help. And so there's a lot of administrative and bureaucratic barriers there. So I did find sorts of the root organizations that actually need help at the ground level, and not just the big NGOs. And I can share those with people. Probably I'll try to put that in the chat box, or I can share it after the presentation if someone wants to reach me for that.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your presentation. That was really well done.